once you've got your camera, your next step is going to be finding the settings that you like best. I'm going to give you some sort of preliminary suggestions, but you're going to have to spend some time comparing different settings and seeing what looks you like best. I've already made the case that you should be filming in 4K, especially for the top down. There are actually two forms of 4K. One's a little bit larger. It's 4096 by 2160. That tends to be used in film. And then there's a 3840 by 2160, which is the resolution, as I understand it, is found on 4K television. So that's the footage that's the resolution I shoot at, 3840 by 2160, that version of 4K. I've already explained that I think 30 FPS is the fastest you have to shoot. I film in 24 frames per second, just to be a little pretentious and because I like that sort of filmic look. You will find another thing when you get out your camera and start to look at recording settings, that you'll have some options for color depth. Now, color is a whole can of worms, a very complicated issue. And if people are shooting professional video, they will often shoot it, bring it into the editor, and then do color grading, where they tweak with the colors to get just the right mood and look and skin tone that they want. If you were planning to do serious color grading during the editing, then there's some real advantages to shooting at something like 10-bit color or higher. But my whole focus is on efficiency. I want to minimize the amount of editing and post-processing I have to do. So I'd rather put in the time to get the lighting just right and the white balance right, and then shoot in 8-bit color for smaller file sizes. And that's what I do. I shoot in 8-bit color. I think if you spend the time getting everything set so that you don't have to do color grading, then that's fine. You might consider filming at a higher color bit rate if you think that you're likely to make some mistakes and have some scenes too bright or too dark, because the higher color bit rate gives you more room to fix that kind of stuff. I've already talked about why I think you should probably have your autofocus off. If it's a fixed environment, there's no reason for your camera to be changing focus while you're recording. So you're just creating potential problems if you leave the autofocus on. But then you do have to remember to focus your shot before you record each video. In general, I'm going to agree with almost everyone on YouTube who's talking about serious filming and recommend that you go full manual. But perhaps we should spend a little bit of time talking about that. When you use a camera, when you get something like a camcorder, it's basically always in a sort of automatic exposure mode. But when you get a mirrorless or DSLR, you've got a whole bunch of different modes to choose from that range from a fully automatic to a full manual. Let's talk about what that automatic manual is doing. It's almost all about exposure, how bright the scene is. If you've got your camera on automatic, fully automatic, your camera is going to adjust a couple settings to get the right exposure, the right brightness of the scene. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, the different settings that can be used to do that. But in brief, you've got aperture, how wide the lens is open. You've got your ISO, which is sort of the gain level of your sensor, how bright it's going to digitally enhance the image. And then you've got shutter speed, how long the shutter is open for each frame of video. all of those things can be changed to get the right brightness, the right exposure for your image. But the important thing to remember is that the camera is not magic. It's looking at this entire scene and it doesn't know what it's taking a picture of. It's got some AI, it can figure out there's a human and a face, but it doesn't know about the rest of the scene. And so it just makes a guess about how bright the scene should be. But that's not always going to be correct. And unless you set it on manual, you are going to get inconsistencies between scenes. You may find that one scene, the automatic settings look reasonably good, but depending on your lighting and who else is in the scene and what's going on, certain areas of the scene may be overexposed, may be too bright and washed out, and certain areas of the scene may be too dark. It's only by manually adjusting these settings that you're going to get a consistent scene and the best settings for your scene. So you will have to set things manually if you want higher quality. Another thing that you'll commonly find on these cameras is some stabilization. But if you're using a tripod and if your top-down camera is mounted, you want to turn those off. There are compromises with those on, such as some cropping on the video or processing. If you're not moving the camera around by hand, you don't want those settings. All right, so I mentioned things like aperture, ISO, shutter speed when I was talking about automatic settings, but now let's spend some time taking a deep dive into those things. On your camera, you'll have control of those three settings, which are going to be the primary drivers of the brightness of your scene. Aperture, how wide the lens is open. The wider the lens is open, the more light comes in, the brighter the image. But also there's a side effect from having a wide open aperture, which is a shallower depth of field, which makes things blurry in front of that zone and behind that zone. So the wider the aperture is, the more you have the blurry background effect that everyone loves on YouTube. The narrower the aperture, the less light gets in, the more you have to turn up your lights or your gain, but the more range is in focus. So this is important if you're filming a board game. If you're just filming a person talking, you normally, if you watch that YouTube with a blurry background, that person has got their aperture set wide open, and different lenses have different maximum apertures. So sometimes you want a lens that can get very wide open, what they call a fast lens or a bright lens, to give you the maximum blurring of the background. However, when you're filming a board game on the table and you want the game to be in focus and the human to be in focus, you can't have that wide open aperture. It's just not possible to get the person in focus and the board in focus with the maximum wide aperture. So you'll have to close down your aperture. When you close down your aperture, you let less light in, and you'll have to adjust other things to get the brightness you want. Okay, that's aperture. ISO is probably the easiest one to sort of wrap your head around, because ISO is basically just the gain of the sensor, how much digital brightness is added to the image. It's a little more complicated than that, but essentially your ISO setting goes from low, which is dark, to super high, which you could even shoot in the dark and you get a reasonable image. So you might ask, well, is there any downside? It's fantastic. I can shoot in the dark. I'll just turn my ISO gain way up. Well, there's a cost to that, and the cost is noise, sort of graininess. So the more sensitive your ISO is, the more sensitive your sensor is tuned to, the brighter it will be, but also the noisier it will be, which is why you need lots of lighting in your room. I'm going to show you some footage at the end of this showing different interactions of these settings, but you could film in a dark room and you could increase that ISO gain and get a bright image, but you'll see it's all grainy and noisy. So you're going to want to balance your settings to give you maximum light in the room so that you could turn that ISO down as low as possible and still get a nice bright image. The third setting on your camera that's going to affect how bright and well exposed your image is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is a weird one to think about, but essentially, the faster the shutter speed, the smaller amount of time the shutter is open to let in light for each frame. So if you've got your shutter speed very slow, let's say it's open the entire time each frame is open. So if you're taking 30 frames per second, every 1/30th of a second, it's taking a frame and the shutter is open for that whole period. That's letting in the maximum light it could possibly let in. Sometimes we talk about shutter angles, 360-degree shutter angle. That would be that, open for the whole frame. That would give you the brightest frame. You could operate with the least need for artificial lighting. But within the duration of that frame, you'll get some blur because all of the light coming in during the duration of that frame being taken, that shutter's open that entire frame, and so all of the light coming in during that course gets sort of blended together. If you set your shutter speed to as fast as possible, just a fraction of the frame, much less light hits the sensor, but you get much less blur. And we're going to see that when we look at the footage. So in general, if you were shooting a sports event, you would change your frame rate as high as possible and your shutter speed as high as possible. And then you get this sort of staccato images and less blur. And we're going to take a look at that in a second. I do want to talk about some other things. So in addition to those settings, the ISO affects the brightness, the aperture affects the brightness, the shutter speed affects the brightness, and also the artificial light affects the brightness. So you have to, all of those things combine to give you the look that you're going to get. And you will have to experiment with finding what combination of settings give you the look you want. And so that's just for those settings. You've got a couple more things to think about when you're thinking about setting up your look, setting up your shots to give you the look you want. Let's talk about a few of them. One of them is going to be where you set your focus. So in general, when you get that shallow depth of field effect where the human is in focus, complete focus, and then things are out of focus behind and out of focus in front, you may find, if you've got a good lens at 4K, that focusing on the person's face is a little too crisp and clear and sharp. So occasionally you'll want to set the focus slightly differently, not on the person. When we film a large board game, I try to set the aperture small enough so that everything's in pretty good focus, but I frequently will set the focus in front of the humans on the board somewhere. That's the area I want to be sharpest. And then it's okay if the humans are a tiny bit blurry. Your human eye doesn't really notice it when it's done right. But that's something to keep in mind. You'd never want the focus behind the people, but it makes sense to have the focus slightly forward of the person on the board if there's a game on the board. Another thing you'll have to start thinking about is white balance. Okay, let's talk about what is this mysterious white balance. Well, When the camera is shooting, the human eye is pretty remarkable, and you know whether you're in daylight and or inside under artificial light. Your eye makes all these adjustments so that what you perceive seems, there's nothing odd about perceiving something outdoors or indoors. You don't see people looking completely differently. Their skin tone doesn't look orange in one scene and blue in another. But in reality, the actual tones of the colors, the color temperature of a face outdoor and indoor is completely different. And the camera needs to know about that. So the camera has some concept of what white should look like given the lighting in the room. So when you mess around with the camera, you'll see white balance for outdoor scene, white balance for an indoor scene. And you probably already know that artificial lights can be different temperature. There's very cool white or a very warm white, which looks a little yellowish. So to boil it down, for all intents and purposes, white balance for you, your concern for white balance is basically going to be about skin tone. And you're going to want to get your white balance such that you're reasonably happy with the skin tone so that you don't have to do color correction later in editing. So one way to set your white balance is you take a white piece of paper, you find your camera's white balance setting, and you say, this is what white looks like in this room with these lights. So you first have to get your lights the way you want them. And we have a whole section on lighting. We'll talk about that. But then the other way to do it is to experiment with white balance settings, indoor, outdoor, customize it, and find the skin tone that you're happy with, and leave the white balance there. Lastly, all of these digital cameras have various sort of color styles that you can choose from. Now, what you're looking at here in this video is a color style called Cine D with some slight tweaks. Cine D is sort of a washed out low contrast color. To me, it looks a little more filmic, like film. It's not as vibrant and as sharp, and the colors aren't as bright and contrasty as some of the other color modes. You'll notice if you watch certain channels or that you'll recognize they've got certain channels are very bright. They've got a high contrast scene, and certain channels prefer sort of a washed out low color scene. For me, this is the look I like, but you know, if you switched to one and used it a couple times, you'd get used to it and that would be your new favorite. But you'll have to play with what settings you like best. And I suggest you spend some real time in the beginning shooting a bunch of different footage at a bunch of different settings and find out what you like best. And you'll find that, you know, if you look at something for a while, it'll look great. Then you'll find something on YouTube, you'll be like, that is amazing. How did they get that look? How is it that dark? Or why does it look that much better bright? And your views may change over time. But the best thing I can advise to you is take some real time in the beginning, make notes, try different settings, find the look you want, document how you got there, and then reproduce it. But let's take a break here and let's look at some combinations of settings and what they look like and the different looks you can get. Okay, now we're going to take a little tour of different camera settings and angles. So we'll look at combinations of ISO, aperture, shutter speed, and different zoom levels to show different amounts on the table, etc. And we'll see how all of those interact. Let's start with what you're looking at here. So we've got a medium to small size board here. Maybe it goes out 1.5 inches. Sorry, 1.5 feet deep. And what we're looking at here is I've got my camera, I've got the 8-18 wide angle zoom lens on the camera, which is my expensive lens. But the zoom is actually set to about 15 millimeters. So actually all of my lenses, all of my normal zoom lenses will work, and the kit lens will work. Anything, those are normally like 12 to 32, 12 to 60 lenses. So as long as we're above 12, those lenses can get this shot. and get in this table, and the camera is about 5 feet away from me. Okay. So we frame the shot so that there's a couple inches above my head and that it gets enough of the table, and we can angle the camera to get that right. Okay, that's the first thing we've got control of, the zoom of the lens and the angle of the camera to frame, get as much as you want on the table and give you enough clearance above the person's head, etc. Okay, what's the next thing we have control over? A big one to get the look you want is the aperture. Now I've got this lens now at 3.7. That's as wide open as it can get, which means the ISO, the gain can be fairly low because it's wide open. The lens is letting in a lot of light. But one of the consequences or benefits, depending on your point of view, of having a wide aperture is a shallow depth of field. So right now the focus is on me, on my face. So as we go further back, it gets blurrier, and as we go more forward from me, it gets blurrier. And you can see the text on this card is kind of blurry. Now, if you watch high production talking head YouTube videos, you'll see this wide aperture, shallow depth of field effect is very popular. And if it's just someone talking to you and they're not showing you something in front of them, then often you want to get as much of that as possible. So the foreground is sharp and the background is very blurry. But you can see if you're trying to show off a board game, that's probably not what you want. If you've got a board game in front of you that the viewer is supposed to be following, you don't want that to be blurry. Okay, so that's aperture, and we're going to play around a little bit with aperture to get that right. But the other thing you've got to play around with for that is where the focus should be. So for example, normally when we shoot, especially at 4K, I don't want to be in perfect focus. It's actually more pleasing to the eye if the person talking is a little bit blurry, just a tiny bit, not as sharp as it could be. Unless you're a supermodel, the skin, it's not all that flattering to be in super 4K focus. Okay, so let's look at the first thing. We're going to leave this wide aperture, which is a shallow depth of field and makes things blurry, and we're going to change the location of focus. I'm going to have it focus on these cards up front here, which will put me a little blurrier and the bookshelf even more blurry. So let's try that. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, so it's done it. You can see this card text is now quite a bit sharper, and I'm quite a bit more blurry, and the background's blurrier still. Okay, is this the look you want? This has the benefit of making the board fairly sharp in focus. Remember, it's going to get less in focus as it comes here, and this part of the board is probably a little bit blurry, and I'm quite a bit blurry. Now, if you were filming this and you were looking at me, would you say that's too blurry? Is the human too blurry in this image? It's hard for me to tell looking at the camera and looking at my monitor here, but my intuition is yes, it's a little too blurry. Okay, so what are your options here? Well, you could set the focus somewhere in the middle here and then make this a little bit blurry and me a little less blurry. That would be one option, but probably for a board game, what you want is the board to be in nice, sharp focus, and it's okay if I'm a little bit blurry. So what do you have to play with here? Well, it's the aperture. The aperture is too wide, it's too shallow a depth of field, and we want a wider depth of field for the board game. So we're going to change the aperture to make it narrower. Now, when we do that, if you'll remember, less light is going to come into the camera, and we're going to have to turn the ISO up, the gain up, to compensate. So let's try it. First, let's mess with the aperture, and we'll go quite a bit higher up just to show the effect more. Let's go up to 8. Okay, so we've narrowed the focus, the aperture, right? Less light's coming in. Now it looks darker, okay? So let's go and increase the ISO, and try to get back to our look that we were at before. Maybe here, somewhere in there. That looks a little brighter. Okay, let's see. I'm not quite sure if I'm quite as bright as I was before, but you get the idea. Okay, now do I look sharper, more in focus? Yes, because now we've got a wider depth of field now that the aperture is narrower. So you can see this is still in focus, and we probably should refocus that just in case. But you can see, even though this is sharp now, I'm quite sharp too. Not perfectly sharp, and the background is sharper, but still a little bit blurry. Now, let's just for the fun of it, try the extreme. Let's go into our aperture and go all the way up to the maximum the lens can do. Okay, 22. Very narrow now, but very dark. So let's go and change our ISO and get back up to where we can see. Right? Okay, so here you go. Now that actually looks a little blurry to my eyes, but once we focus in, it should be okay. All right, so now we've got the aperture super narrow. I mean, it's super narrow. And we've had to boost the gain, the ISO up way high. Everything should be equal focus, although it doesn't look like this lens is having a great time with that. But we're paying a cost now. We've introduced a huge amount of noise to the image because we've tried to raise the gain so high. So even if it is in perfect focus, which it doesn't look like it really is, it's very noisy. So this is much too high aperture. So let's go back down again. And let's go down to something more reasonable. Like 8. Now we've widened up, much more light. We have to turn down the light. So part of what you'll get the hang of as you do this is sort of understanding what the range of your camera, its light sensitivity, gives you a nice, good image. So I rarely ever go to an aperture of 8 or 1/8. But this is a reasonable setting. Normally I would go to for this shorter board, maybe a 7, aperture of 7.0. But you get the idea here. We've now got the board sharp. I'm fairly sharp in background, and you could play around with that a little. You might go, okay, that's too much. Let's see if we can get the human, a little bit blurry and get the ISO down to a reasonable level. Maybe even a little darker. And maybe that's pretty good. Maybe that puts the board nice and sharp, and I'm mostly sharp, but a little bit blurry. Okay, so that's a good first shot look at how messing with the aperture and the location of focus is. And if you did this, maybe you could say, well, let's go back to focusing the human as sharp as possible, and we'll take a little bit blurry on the board. Still don't love that. So maybe we're going to focus on the middle of the board somewhere. Maybe that's a good compromise for us. Maybe that gives the board nice and sharp from top to bottom. Human can be a little bit blurry. Okay, that gives you some idea. And my recommendation is have a little checklist and have something that says, for a normal board game, I want aperture 6.3 and put the focus somewhere in the middle of the board. That's what I normally do. I normally try to focus somewhere down here so that the board is the star, and if the human's a little blurry, that's fine. And I focus somewhere in the middle of the board. Sometimes I'll just put up something here and focus in on that. And you could do that. You could just put your hand up and try to focus on that if you want to focus a little bit in front of the table. The autofocus and focus on this camera is not so great. But okay, so there's the idea, and you saw a little bit of how messing with the ISO has an effect. Of course, remember the ISO is sort of the gain. So the smaller the aperture, the more you'll have to turn up the ISO, but that also depends on your lighting. If I had no lights on, I'd have to turn the gain way up. So one of the things I look at is I look at whatever setting I have. Sometimes it can be hard to see all the noise on the screen, but I know this camera can do 1600 ISO, looks quite good, does not look noisy. But if I start getting higher than 1600, I know I need more natural light in the room, or I need a wider aperture, or a longer shutter speed, which we'll look at in a second. Okay, what shall we look at next? Let's look at some, maybe we should have done this earlier. Let's look at some different ISO settings to give you some idea of what kind of brightness you want. I watch some YouTube videos sometimes and they are very dark. Now here's another, we've been talking about cases where if you're just talking to the camera, if it's just a talking head, certain settings are reasonable. But if you're trying to show off a board and you're doing board game stuff, that's not quite true. And darkness is one of those things. It's become very chic or whatever to have a very dark video when you're talking to the camera. This might be a little too dark, but it's not that uncommon for someone to light up their foreground face and keep the background quite dark. And you do see videos that are this dark. But if you're trying to show off the board, that's problematic. I don't want to be looking at a dark board. So for board game stuff, I think you have to decide a little bit on bright. But you could also try lighting your board more and keeping the face and background darker. Okay, so let's just look at some more ISO settings just to give you an idea of, so you can see how dark do you want your videos to be. So here's 1250. That's pretty good from my standpoint. Now, here's an interesting thing. I've suggested that you have your camera settings all manual. So manual ISO, aperture, shutter speed. And one of the things you realize, like if you're used to using just a point and click camera and you've got everything set on automatic, you say, oh, let the camera make these decisions for me. Well, the camera does not know exactly what you're filming. And so if you've got a black background, it thinks it's dark and it ramps up. It wants the ISO higher and wants it brighter. So you really do need manual control of these things. But it is useful to see what the camera thinks about the exposure. So right now the camera is telling me it thinks it's a little underexposed, so it's recommending it a little brighter. And even if I don't follow that recommendation, it does help to develop some sort of experience with where you like your setting. So I know I like my setting with the camera thinking it's a little bit dark. So, but you could experiment a little and you'll get the hang of it. And if you keep a checklist, you'll get fairly consistent, but it's not unusual to have one video be a little bit brighter than another. But if you keep your settings written down, you'll get it about right, and you'll get used to knowing what it looks like. That when you get the look you want, you'll know how to adjust it. But remember, every time you change the aperture, you'll have to change the ISO, etc. All right, we looked at changing your location of focus. We looked at changing the ISO and the aperture. What else can we mess with? All right, so one of the other things you can mess with is shutter speed. Now, I follow the advice of just always keeping your shutter speed at 180 degrees, which basically, I think it means the shutter is half the length of the frame rate. So if you're shooting 24 frames per second, your shutter is opening and closing 48 times per second. And that gives a sort of filmic look. But let's see if we can break this down in non-technical terms. The aperture, the wider the aperture, the more light that comes in for each frame. If we're shooting 24 frames per second, then 25 times per second, the camera is letting in some light and letting light hit the sensor for a short period of time. The shutter speed is another independent variable that controls how much light comes onto each frame. If you shorten the shutter speed, then the sensor's only letting light hit it for a fraction of the period that it's taking that image for the frame. And so you get a darker image, but an image with less blur. The longer the shutter speed, the more the shutter is open during that frame, the more blur you get, because any movement during the course of that frame gets mixed together and blended. So let's look at some of the effect. But first, this is the 180 degree. So I recommend just leaving your shutter speed at 180 degrees. And that gives us sort of motion blur that we're used to from seeing in film. So here's how we're going to do this test. I'm going to wave for each of these different settings of shutter speed, and you'll see what it looks like. But I'm going to do something first. I'm going to change the ISO. Well, let's not change the ISO. Let's show you how shutter affects the light coming in, and then we'll turn it to automatically. Okay, so here we are. I'm waving, and this is with my 180-degree shutter speed, and you can see there's some blur in my hand, right? So it's fast motion where you're going to notice the difference here. Okay, now let's change the shutter speed, and we're going to make it much faster. So we're going to go down to 30. Okay, so now shutter is open for a much shorter time for each frame, which makes it darker. So we have to compensate that by raising the ISO gain. And we're going to raise it to something that looks about what it was before. Okay. All right. So now it looks about the same brightness, but I've achieved that brightness with a shorter shutter speed and a much higher gain. All right. So let's see what that looks like when I wave. Do you see the difference? It's not so blurry now. There's not motion blur. It looks like lots of different little images. All right. So you'd have to ask yourself, is that what I want? Do I want less motion blur? But the price of that is I have to turn the gain up, which introduces a little more noise in the image. Now, I'm at 8,000 ISO now, and you'd have to decide. I can't tell now if it's noticeably noisier, grainier on the screen. But I know that basically for this camera, when I have to go up to 8,000 ISO, it's going to start getting noisy, and I don't want to get there. And for a board game without lots of movement, I think board game does not need high shutter speed. If you were filming sports, etc., then you might. But for a board game, you don't need it. That's why I recommend sticking to that 180-degree shutter speed, which brings you a blur that looks normal. Okay, let's try the other thing. Let's change it to a very long shutter speed and see what happens. So I'm going to go to shutter speed all the way on the other end, 360, which means it's open for the entire frame. You can see how bright it is now because the shutter is open twice as long as normal. So now I have to bring the ISO way down. So here's where it was normally, but it's too bright now. So we'll go down a little bit more. Okay, so this looks about what it was before. So if I'm just sitting still, it should look about the same. Now I've got the ISO 640, much lower than it was before, so less noise. This is actually a less noisy image. But now we have much more motion blur when I move. Now, is that okay for board game? Maybe it is. Maybe when you reach around, the amount of blur is not so bad. It's not bothersome, but it's more than we're used to. We're used to seeing 180 degree. This looks a little weird to look at, I think, the amount of blur. But if you had a very bad lighting situation, you didn't have lights, that might be one way you could get a brighter image without having to turn the gain up, change the shutter speed. But let's go back. I think this is one setting, 180 degrees, that you can basically leave it at. Now we're going to bring our ISO back to our normal. So I keep saying 180 degrees. That's because this camera has a way of saying no matter what I set the frame rate to, make my shutter speed a ratio of that. If your camera doesn't have that, it doesn't matter. You'll be shooting at your normal videos will be shot at a fixed frame rate, either 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second, which is what I use. You'll just go online and you'll see what you'll search for what's the 180 degree shutter speed for 24 frames per second, and it'll tell you 48, and you'll set your shutter speed to 1/48, etc. All right, what else do we need to look at? How about we look at white balance? All right, so there is a whole science behind color grading footage, adjusting the color of footage. And a big part of that has to do with the temperature of the image. Now, if you look at this, for our concerns, for our purposes, the only really relevant thing that you care about is skin tone. So when I'm putting out these videos, I've got control over my skin tone. Now in real life, I've got kind of a pink, unpleasant skin tone on camera default, but you can play with that a little bit, and depending on the lights you're using and the settings on your camera you're using, whatever, and white balance has a big impact on that. Normally, when the optimal way, theoretically, that you would set your white balance is you'd get your camera out, you'd go to white balance, and you'd hold a sheet of white paper up, pure white, whatever your white is. You'd hold that in front of the camera and you'd set the white balance. You'd tell the camera, take a look at how that sheet of white paper looks like in my lighting situation with the lights I have, and that's white. Treat that as white and adjust all the other colors. So that's what setting your white balance is. And I've got a setting for that, and it's going to depend on your lights. And we'll talk about lighting, but the temperature of your lights, whether they're cool, bluish, or warm and yellowish, that's going to affect the look. And you can use the white balance to compensate for whatever lights you have. So it doesn't really matter what lights you have, as long as the white balance is compensating for that. So what's the important point here? The only important point here is get your light set up the way you want it, bright enough and comfortable enough to play. I like to play in warm light, so I have my lights in the room set up to give a fairly comfortable warm light. And then I've adjusted the white balance. Once my lights are set up the way they want, I've adjusted the white balance, and that's what you see here. But you could, just to give you an idea of different kinds of color temperature effects with different white balance, let's look at some of them. Okay, so here's my one preset, but here's another one which is very similar, but a little bluish, a little more blue, a little less yellow. And then let's take a look at the camera's values. So here's automatic white balance. So this is if you tell the camera, try to use your AI magic to figure out what the color tone should be. This does not look right to me. But again, you wouldn't be using any of the automatic settings on your camera. But let's look at some other white balance. I'm not sure what AWC. This is cool, automatic, and then warm, automatic. Here's what it would, if we were outside in the sun and the camera's trying to adjust for that. This is what it looks like. Obviously unusable. And then we've just got some different settings based on telling the camera, trust me, my lights are like this, and try to correct for that. You can see most of these aren't that good. So you will find the look you want, and you should start by setting up the lights you want, putting a piece of white paper, and then doing it. But then you could tweak it a little bit and try to get the skin tone the way you're comfortable with. If you were doing professional video shooting, you would try to get it about right, and then you'd go and do the process of color grading the footage during your editing and adjusting the temperature to get it exactly right. The human eye is a weird thing. If you look at it a certain way for a while, you get used to it and everything else looks different. Then you come back to it later and you say, whoa, that skin tone looks completely weird. How could I have ever thought it was good? You'll have to experiment. You'll find out what skin tone, color, temperature you like best. There's white balance. Okay, now we're going to look at some different camera styles. I'm going to give you a tour of the ones available for this camera, the Lumix GH5S. Your camera, if you have a different brand, will have different styles, but this will just give you a sort of idea of what sort of stuff's available. So for the videos I put out, I use a Cine-D style, Cine-D. I just happen to like how it's sort of low contrast, sort of looks like almost like a little bit of a retro filmy look. But that may not be to your taste. So let's take a look at some of the different options available for this camera in terms of style. Okay, so here's Cine-D. And you can see, you can't see, but I've actually tweaked it a little bit. On my setting, I can change some various settings, but let's look at what else is available. Okay, here's Cine-like V, which feels to me much too much contrast. There's dark, very dark areas and very light. Okay, this one is called Like 709. Here, there are a bunch of ones that are low contrast but made to do post-processing color. Vlog is the famous one. You'd never use this right out of the camera. Here's the standard look from this, the standard setting for this camera. Now, probably if you were going to use this, you'd want to change it and make it brighter. So let's see what it looks like if we make it a little brighter, because that's too dark there. Okay, so here it is a little bit brighter. That's too bright. All right, so this looks a little harsh to my eyes. Let's go back and try some more styles. Okay, this one's called standard. What else we got? Vivid. Here's vivid. To my eyes, looks too black in certain areas. Higher contrast. Here's natural. This one is reasonable, but I still like the Cine D better. Black and white monochrome. Here's one called Scenery. Here's one called Portrait. And there's a couple of custom settings. And here we are back to Cine-like D. Again, it's a little bit like the color grading. Once you get used to one for a while, it looks normal. Then you change it, it looks really weird. Then you get used to it, and changing it away looks weird. So this is the one I like, Cine-like D, and it's tweaked a little bit. You could see I've actually got the saturation color up a little bit and contrast up a little bit. You could mess with those if you wanted to turn your saturation of color really low. There's a really low contrast, low color, or you could go in the other direction and you could try to bump up, make the colors sharper. That doesn't look too bad. You can see how they all interact. So that's basically how I have it. There, if we got contrast, we can make it, we could up the contrast. Now we've got blacker blacks and whiter whites, or you could go down a bit, go in the other direction, have it really washed out. And etc. So lots of things you can mess with. So that's the style setting of your camera. You'll find something that you like best.